Great. Then I will hand over to Ella to introduce this roundtable.
Okay, so thank you all for joining us. This is the Roundtable on Forced Migration and Local Outcomes, a Global Perspective, which is as it says. So just again, before we start, for those who don't know what GLD is, we're the Governance and Local Development Institute. Basically, if you turn to the next slide, our mission is to essentially promote what we think of as promoting human welfare by conducting scientifically rigorous research across the globe. So we've worked in sub-Saharan Africa, we've worked in the Middle East, we're turning to other parts of the world. Our research focuses on answering a fundamental question of why are some communities able to provide secure environments, good education, adequate health care, and other factors that encourage human development while others fail to do so. So we engage with communities across the world. We develop methodological tools to do this. We gather data, undertake analyses on major issues affecting societies today, including issues of migration, and then we disseminate findings to academics, relevant policymakers, and communities in which we work. There's a few ways, if you go to the next slide, in which we could sort of do this. Obviously, it's research, and it's on issues of everything from migration to trying to understand what helps to alleviate poverty and other sort of major issues. We have a set of data that we've collected that is available on the data pages of our website. We also offer data support for those who either have questions, methodological questions, or who need support in conducting survey work. We have a series of educational material. We also work very hard to create a lot of different ways in which we can promote a scholarly network where we can not only learn from others, but also people can learn from each other. And then we work with policy engagement, trying to make the findings of our own research applicable to others, but also to help others sort of connect their research to the policy world. So there's, if you next slide, please, a number of ways in which you can engage. So you can not only use the educational material that you find online, but you can also contribute to it. And there you'll find, for instance, that we have material that's available both in English and in Arabic, including, for example, a YouTube series on research that Dan, actually, who will be joining us today, has contributed to, as well as Marwa. You can co-write a policy brief or executive summary, drawing from your own work to help make it sort of disseminate the findings and make it applicable to the policy world. You can get, as I mentioned, data and survey support. You can participate in the Work in Progress workshop series, both by joining it as a participant, but also presenting in it. And you can both submit and read GLD working papers. So I just wanted, again, to give you a sense of who we are. Next slide, please. If you want to learn more, obviously you can sort of visit the GLD website, but also feel free to reach out to us. So that's just to set the stage and give you a sense of who's bringing this roundtable to you today. It's a roundtable that is being funded by the Swedish Research Council as well as the Carnegie Corporation of New York. So next slide, I want to turn to the reason why everybody's here today, which is really to think about forced migration and local outcomes and think about it in terms of a global perspective. And I'm very pleased that Dr. Kelsey Norman has agreed to be the moderator of today's session. Kelsey is the fellow and director of the Women's Rights, Human Rights, and Refugees program. She's a fellow at the Rice University's Baker Institute, and she also teaches courses in the Department of Political Science and the Master of Global Affairs program at Rice. Her first book, which we have a podcast on, if you're interested in listening to her talk about it in more detail, is Reluctant Reception, Refugees, Migration, and Governance in the Middle East and North Africa, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2021. And it was based on 3 years of fieldwork in Egypt, Morocco, and Turkey. It was selected as one of Choice Outstanding Titles for 2021 and was awarded an honorable mention at the American Political Science Association's Migration and Citizenship 2021 Best Book Committee. She's currently working on a second book with a co-author, and that is titled Migration Management Aid, Governance and Repression, and it's going to look at how countries use foreign aid to prevent migration from the global south to the global north. And with that, again, I'm really delighted to have you here, Kelsey, and I'm going to turn it over to you to help inform us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ellen. Thanks also, Marwa and Sarah, for inviting me to moderate this session on a topic I care deeply about. And I'm excited to introduce now a panel of other experts on migration and displacement globally. So I believe the structure I'll introduce the speakers. They'll each have about 3 to 5 minutes to give kind of an introductory set of remarks around their research area. And then we'll have a set of questions that I'll ask them and a discussion, and then we'll open it up to questions from everyone in the audience. So first we'll hear from Dr. Elizabeth Ferris. She is professor and director at the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown University. She is also an adjunct professor at Georgetown Law School. She has served as a senior advisor to the UN General Assembly Summit for Refugees and Migrants in New York in 2016, and as an expert advisor to the UN's high-level panel on internal displacement from 2019 to 2021. From 2006 to 2015, she was a senior fellow and co-director of the Brookings LSE project on internal displacement, where she worked to support understanding and protection of internally displaced persons. Prior to joining Brookings, she spent 20 years working in the field of humanitarian assistance, most recently in Geneva, Switzerland, at the World Council of Churches. And then after Beth, we'll hear from Daniel Masterson, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of California, Santa Barbara. So he studies migration, displacement, and humanitarian policy with a regional focus in the Middle East. He is also a faculty affiliate at the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, JPAL, the Center for Effective Global Action, Innovations for Poverty Action, Immigration Policy Lab, the UCSB Migration Initiative, and the UCSB Center for Middle East Studies. So very busy. Daniel Masterson's work has appeared or is forthcoming in the American Political Science Review, the British Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Conflict Resolution, and Political Science Research and Methods. His research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, JPAL, Evidence in Governance and Politics, IPA, the UNHCR, and the World Bank. And a number of media outlets have also covered his research, including the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, and The Economist. And then third, we'll hear from Jocelyn Perry. She is a senior advocate and program manager of the Climate Displacement Program at Refugees International. And she also has a decade of experience working in advocacy, policymaking, research, and direct service on climate change with displaced populations. Most recently, Jocelyn managed a research theme on migration, urbanization, and climate change at the University of Pennsylvania's Global Public Policy Hub, connecting research with policymakers and practitioners. She also served as a Fulbright Public Policy Fellow with the government of Malawi, working for their Department of Refugees and Dzaleka refugee camp. I don't know if I said that correctly, Jocelyn. Jocelyn is currently completing a part-time doctorate in public policy at the University of Oxford's Blavnik School of Government, focusing on stakeholder involvement in municipal climate adaptation planning across the United States. So really these speakers bring a wealth of knowledge, both from a research perspective, an academic perspective, as well as a practitioner perspective, and they cover various global regions. So as I said, we'll hear a few remarks from each of them in that order, and then we'll have a set of questions. And please, if you have questions, drop them in the chat, or towards the end, we'll open it up and you can raise your hand and ask a question. Okay, so first we'll turn it over to Beth.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to join this panel and to talk about the issue, particularly with a focus on local outcomes and local solutions, because we need a lot more attention to that. When I think about the global displacement situation, you know, the headlines are full of figures of unprecedented numbers of people who've moved. But for me, the biggest problem is protracted displacement. You know, new refugee numbers are added every year, every 6 months to already existing huge caseloads of people who've been living in limbo. 2/3 of the world's refugees and IDPs, internally displaced persons, have been displaced for more than 5 years, and many have been displaced more than 20 years. They exist in every region of the world and really lacking solutions. Our three traditional solutions are either to go back home, conflicts end, or disasters end. And that's becoming more difficult as conflicts drag on and on, or they're integrated locally in their communities. Sometimes they're in another country for refugees or another part of the country for IDPs, and yet the reality is that governments never welcome people arriving uninvited on their borders and expecting to stay a long time. And local governments are finding it increasingly difficult. Welcome wears thin, and no prospects for full integration into those communities is limited. We see it in places like Jordan and Lebanon, but also in places like Mexico and Chad and many, many other countries. The third option of moving elsewhere, either to a third country or elsewhere in the country, is also limited. Resettlement numbers have been largely stagnant for a long time. There aren't a lot of new countries, jumping up and down to host more refugees. And so the traditional solutions are stuck. And so we're left with this situation of steadily increasing numbers and a dearth of solutions. Back in 2000, UNHCR reported that for every new refugee, there was one refugee that found a solution, one of the three traditional solutions. In 2022, the last year of available statistics, it was that for every 16 new refugees, one found a solution. So I think we need to put a lot more attention on finding solutions for those who've been displaced for a while, at the same time that we're adding to, responding to these new ways. And, I can talk later, Kelsey, if you like, about Central America, but the fact is that the 520,000 people who crossed the Darien Gap last year were not mostly coming from their countries of origin. They tried before. They'd settled in Brazil or Colombia or Chile from all over the world. And when things didn't work out, they moved on, as people always do. So really supporting local integration, local governments to do more with people who've been displaced for many years is, I think, the number one challenge we're facing.
Great. Thank you so much, Beth. So Daniel, we'll turn it over to you for opening remarks.
Great. Thank you very much, Kelsey. So the situation I want to reflect on briefly is a bit of on refugees worldwide, but then also thinking about the Middle East, which is where most of my research is and what I'll mostly be speaking about today. And the first point that I'd like to make is sort of what I see as a misconception or a misunderstanding among many people about displacement worldwide and in the Middle East. And so I want to take a minute to sort of describe what I view as the nature of displacement and refugee survival for many refugees worldwide in a way that's more accurate than maybe common media portrayals and political discussions. I think for many observers, casual observers in the US or Europe, or images in Western media, or even people listening to speeches from UN officials, they might think of refugees coming to Europe and the US in large numbers, majority of refugees living in camps, living off aid. But the reality that I want to try to get across is that most refugees around the world live in developing countries, not in Europe or North America. Most are not in camps. Most live in urban areas, live in Beirut, Amman, Bogota, Nairobi, Johannesburg. And I'm hesitant to offer numbers here. When you offer statistics like 80% of refugees live in developing countries or 3/4 live outside of refugee camps, these numbers change year to year. And actually, it's quite hard for organizations to give reliable estimates for these numbers. But nonetheless, we can assert confidently the vast majority of refugees live in developing countries, live outside of refugee camps. And another possibly surprising for many people fact is that most refugees do not get a lot of assistance and do not get solutions. And so a tiny share of refugees worldwide get resettled to third countries. A tiny share of refugees get local citizenship in a hosting country. And some refugees each year are able to return to their home country, but a substantial number cannot. And so many refugees are left struggling with living in displacement. And during displacement, most are not dependent on humanitarian aid. And so again, this is a place where it's hard to get reliable numbers. But I've seen multiple estimates that a vast majority of people living as refugees are not receiving humanitarian assistance. And also we can look to try and get a sense of, for those receiving assistance, what's the scale of the assistance? And the reality that I would assert is that for most receiving assistance, their basic needs are not covered by that assistance. And so what that gives us is that most refugees around the world are living in the developing world, are living in cities. They're not living off or quote unquote dependent on assistance. They're working together, collaborating to mitigate their own problems, figuring out how to work with municipal officials and get water installed to refugees living around them and to themselves and their family. And so we need to recognize those realities and have those be the premise for how we think about research on refugees, policy design. We need to center the fact that refugees are the primary agents in their own survival.
Okay, thank you so much, Daniel. Jocelyn, over to you.
Thank you so much. And I think the benefit of going after the first two speakers is that a lot of what I have to say is sort of going to build on and agree with those, but with the overlay of climate change and what that might bring to future trends and future solutions. And I think responding to sort of some of the biggest misconceptions around climate change and displacement and migration is that this is a wholly new phenomena, or that this needs wholly new or separate solutions, that responding to some of the previous pushes for separate conventions or declarations on climate change and refugee protection or displacement, when the reality is that our migration systems haven't been up to the task of responding to the realities of displacement and migration for many years now. Sitting here in the US, where I'm based, we haven't passed migration legislation in 30 years, and climate change is exacerbating those existing challenges of a lack of appropriate migration pathways and support to displaced populations and support for preparing and responding to disasters. But it's not requiring wholly new approaches. It just requires that we actually respond to protracted displacement situations as well as new displacements with appropriate responses that we largely know a lot of the proper solutions to, but the political will doesn't exist in order to implement them. And then I think to some of Daniel's comments about urban populations, as we're seeing with climate change, there's also this misconception that climate will drive large-scale displacement from the global south to the global north, when we know most of this displacement will likely be internal, will probably be rural to urban, whether that's to smaller cities or to capital cities within countries. And that's, again, layering on top of existing urbanization trends that would be happening with or without climate change. But irregular rainfall, drought, extreme heat, crop failure, different insects, all because of climate change, are adding on to that economic distress that's already there, that's making rural livelihoods difficult to sustain. And then as populations move to urban areas, they're requiring a lot more support and feeding into challenges that we already have. Most of my work is in sub-Saharan Africa, but the same challenges exist in the US as well, that there's a shortage of affordable housing. There's a lack of enough school places for children that are moving in. There's a lack of sufficient health care for people. And so cities are the ones that are being tasked with implementing that for new arrivals, whether those are people from other countries or from their own country, but don't necessarily have the regulatory authority to respond appropriately to that the national government is the one making those policies. The national government is responsible for developing adaptation plans and funding those responses to climate change, as well as mitigation efforts, not to mention. But city governments are really the ones tasked with doing all of this implementation when it comes to safe housing, transportation options, waste management, all of the daily activities that keep our lives running. And so I think when you have larger scale movements of people, that just adds on to the burden that cities, especially in the global south, already do not have the funding and capacity to deal with. But we're not addressing that both from a national government in those countries' perspective, nor from the international community and donor country perspectives. And there's not a lot of coordination right now when it comes to supporting cities from donor countries. That there's maybe a lot of studies done on scoping projects. Those aren't being well coordinated. And that the implementation of that, especially if you're talking about people with irregular status, they're not necessarily being included in those programs for fear of retribution because of their status or deportation or movement to a camp. So I think those are some of the climate changes feeding into these protracted challenges, but the solutions come from migration, refugee studies, and urban planning that we've maybe known for decades, but are just exacerbating these problems and adding some additional layers to them. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jocelyn. We have a lot to go on from these three sets of comments. So I'll ask one question to start us off. Within your sort of geographic region of focus, and I know some of you work on multiple regions, but for the sake of exploring different regions, maybe Beth, you could talk about Central and Latin America, Daniel, the Middle East, and Jocelyn, Sub-Saharan Africa. And within those different regions, do you see a set of common challenges that are global in nature, or are there specific challenges to your region, whether in terms of funding or protracted displacement or local government actors not being able to address the needs of displaced people? So if you could just talk a little bit about some of the specific or maybe global aspects of the region that you mostly focus on. We'll go in the order that we started off with, so Beth and then Daniel and then Jocelyn.
Okay, with respect to migration or displacement in the Americas, there are many common features with other parts of the world. People move for a variety of reasons. It's often a mixture of political and economic. Venezuelans, for example, are leaving their country in large numbers because of political instability, authoritarian rule, persecution, but also because they can't get medicines or food, or the schools and public systems are simply inadequate. So it's kind of a combination. I think we see this in all regions. It's sometimes hard to distinguish between displacement and migration, particularly when you add in, as Jocelyn said, environmental factors, certainly a region in Central America as well, with hurricanes and dry corridors and so forth. What makes the Americas somewhat unique, I think, is just the draw of the United States and the incredible volatility of U.S. immigration policy. So you see people moving when they think they're going to be able to cross the border, fewer when they perceive the border is closed. And you have, just since this crazy U.S. policy of changing the rules, sometimes every week, as to who is allowed to enter, who is allowed to approach an asylum officer. There's now a new app that would-be asylum seekers can use. It has lots of glitches to it. So you've got a, really crazy situation where people are moving largely in response to what's happening in the U.S. And right now, this week, for example, there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen on the border. And we think that's going to be reflected in changed patterns of migration and efforts to reach there. Also, something you see in the Americas that you also see in Europe are these policies of externalization, where the U.S. government is, nicely said, cooperating with governments in the region, or not so politely, is paying governments in the region to prevent migrants or would-be asylum seekers from reaching their border. Mexico now is moving tens of thousands of migrants away from its northern border with the U.S. to its southern border with Guatemala, in response to U.S. pressures to do everything they can to stop people coming to the U.S. border. So that isn't unique to Latin America, unfortunately, but it's certainly very prevalent in the Americas. And I think these kind of policies are frankly leading to the erosion of the whole global refugee regime, when countries that are signatories to the 1951 Refugee Convention are finding ever more creative ways to get out of exercising those obligations. So Latin America is unique because of the U.S., but it shares a lot in common with all other regions.
Thank you. Dan?
So to talk about the issues around displacement that are particular to or particularly salient in the Middle East, I mean, we need to talk about Palestinians, Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Lebanon, Syria, and in this way, the issues related to displacement in the Middle East that we're talking about are firmly grounded in the Middle East, but not particular or isolated to the Middle East. They are both driven by international politics, and they shape international politics and the international refugee regime. And so I'm sure that everyone knows now about Israel's ongoing bombardment of Gaza and the fact that more than 90% of Gazans have been forced to flee their homes, ongoing displacement in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and also Israel's attack on Lebanon, forcing people to flee their homes in Lebanon. This includes Lebanese, Syrian refugees, Palestinian refugees, migrant workers in Lebanon. And in addition to these, extremely violent, deadly attacks that are causing widespread displacement, we also see the ongoing Syrian refugee crisis more than a decade on. And looking to Sudan, more than 10 million people, I've seen estimates up to 15 million people are displaced due to recent fighting in Sudan. And so, tragically, what we see is widespread displacement, a lot of it driven by U.S. funding and Israeli attacks. And the broader international context for this is, the reality is the U.S. is the primary supporter of the international refugee system, in the sense that the U.S. funds approximately the number of 40% of UNHCR's budget. And the U.S. resettles a tremendous number of refugees, often more than the rest of the world combined in many years. But at the same time, the U.S. is the greatest threat, I would assert, to the international refugee system by facilitating the forced displacement of Palestinians, and now the forced displacement of Lebanese and of Syrian refugees. And this isn't just new displacement, this is sometimes renewed displacement. So looking to Gaza, of the roughly 5 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, about half of them were already registered as refugees. And so what this means is attacks on Palestinians are often attacks on refugees, attacks that undermine the protections that refugees need to have under the international refugee regime, even though Palestinians are not protected under the system of UNHCR, a separate system under UNRWA. And also looking to Lebanon, attacks that are forcing Syrians to go back to Syria before it's safe, are a fundamental delegitimization of the international refugee system. And so we really have a very concerning situation with, I think, international implications for refugee protection, given the U.S.'s active support of Israel's attacks in Gaza and in Lebanon.
Okay, thank you so much, Dan. Jocelyn.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's obviously similarities and differences across the regions, but coming to the Sub-Saharan Africa region, one of the big pieces that distinguishes it from the Americas, certainly, and to a degree the Middle East, is the large-scale use of encampment policies still, and the protracted nature of many of the people that are living in those camps. And so this goes to some of Beth's comments at the start, that we have protracted situations where people are living with an extreme degree of restrictions on their freedom of movement, on their right to own property, or have land tenure, or start businesses, or even the right to work in the formal economy for decades. And that in many countries that are hosting refugees in Africa, a lot of refugees have been born in these communities, they've grown up in these communities, but they are born without citizenship rights. They don't have the right to leave the camp in which they're living in many cases. And there's no real movement, with the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, and the Global Compact on Refugees was the last attempt, and that didn't get off the ground in a lot of places. having worked on the pilot in Malawi, it was sort of agreed to in theory, but never implemented in practice. And so we're watching what happens in Kenya now with their new Refugees Act and the Sharika plan if it's implemented. But I think there's still a lot of question marks for people in terms of what a future looks like, whether that's local integration with actual political and property rights or return. And I think when we come to the idea of return and you layer climate change into that, you have a lot of people, say, living in Uganda from South Sudan and a lot of areas of South Sudan that are just not inhabitable at the moment because of the effects of climate change. And then again, to Beth's point, we're sort of layering on new crises of new arrivals from Sudan coming to areas where South Sudanese refugees have been living for decades. And so you're sort of straining the capacity of government, UNHCR, and other aid actors with new arrivals when we haven't actually come to any solutions for those previous arrivals or people who were born there. And I mean, when you look at demographics, the majority of people living in these settlements or camps are under 30, and the camps have been there for 30 years. So we can assume that the majority of people in a lot of these settlements or camps have lived there their entire lives, but are still not being offered the opportunity to integrate into the host society. And I think maybe Kelsey, you're best placed to speak to this, but rather than sort of the US and US influence largely, then we have the European influence in Africa and sort of migration management policies that are being used to really contain onward migration or movement from a lot of these countries in Africa. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Jocelyn. Well, another question then to pick up on something that you've all touched on now, which is this issue of protracted displacement, and to kind of maybe shift the conversation a little bit towards maybe solution-oriented or best practices. What does the research, your own or that of others, tell us about addressing protracted displacement when, as Beth said, when displacement lasts for longer than 5 years, in regard to host country integration, if that's an option, socioeconomic well-being for refugees and for host communities, as well as political stability. And this can be at a national or maybe even better subnational level. So if you want to talk about that from your own research, from your own region, or that you're also familiar with from other regions. Same order.
Okay. Most of my research is focused on solutions for internal displacement and particularly local integration. There have been some wonderful initiatives in the past year or two looking at how we measure progress toward solutions. It's not really a binary. You're unintegrated or you're integrated. There's a continuum in there. So can we identify factors that help people move towards solutions? And so far, it seems like safety is number one. People need to feel safe where they are. Research we've recently done with IOM with 120,000 cases shows that most IDPs do feel safe where they are, which is great. It means that some of our protection mechanisms are working. But then comes the issue of livelihoods and economic security. All the focus group discussions we did, economic security was number one. If you don't have enough food to sustain your family, kids don't go to school, you can't access health services. There are all kinds of problems that come with not having livelihood. So I think that, engaging development actors in the private sector in developing jobs and livelihoods for IDPs is key. Also, another factor that kind of surprised us when we looked at the results was how important housing is. We can't really talk about causation that, having stable housing leads to good jobs. It could work the other way around. If you're economically secure, you can afford better housing. But it seems that, housing is more than just a physical structure. You need an address often to get a job, for example. A sense of belonging, of home, of feeling like you're rooted in a community seems to come with having adequate housing or shelter. I think this is very concrete guidance for governments. If you want to help IDPs find solutions, help them find jobs and find adequate housing. And those seem to be really important factors. So I think we're kind of honing in on what it takes. The missing piece is, I think, the the role of the receiving community. And I prefer the word receiving because hosting community sounds like people were invited in and are, we're enjoying hospitality, when often communities don't have a lot to say about who arrives. And this is where I think the local issues come in. They're so importantly the role of local government, the role of local civil society organizations, the way that people come to feel like they're part of a society. That's an essential element of integration that often isn't captured by our measures of income or housing or even access to services. Do people feel comfortable? Do they feel like they're getting along with their neighbors? Do they have something in common with this new society? So, I really hope that some future research can focus on these social connections. Social cohesion is a big word in the literature right now, but how it affects displaced people's ability to find solutions, I think, is really a challenge for all of us.
Great, thank you. And on to Dan.
So I want to first draw attention to what I view as a regularity in national responses to refugee populations in many countries around the world, which is that many countries seem to operate under the assumption that if life is too good for refugees in a hosting country, they'll stick around, they'll stay, they'll refuse to go home. And so this often leads to policy responses that aim to make life difficult for refugees, to immiserate refugees under this either implicit or sometimes explicit theory that if life is hard enough for them, they'll go home sooner. And I don't want to overstate the body of evidence on this, but a paper that I was a co-author on that came out last year in the British Journal of Political Science, looking at the Syrian refugee situation in Lebanon, finds that, at least in this case, in this study, the evidence doesn't seem to back that up. What we see in that study, and again, it's one study, and I hope that that we can develop a broader base of evidence on this, but is that the sort of challenges for Syrians in Lebanon, not being able to work, not being able to send their kids to school, financial hardship, do not push people to return. They obviously have clear, direct negative impacts on people's quality of life. They are immiserating people, but it doesn't seem like they're actually increasing people's likelihood of returning. And this has really important implications for how host governments design policy. Where, if host governments are actually trying to promote return, then making life hard for refugees, if we take this evidence at face value, is not the right policy lever to push on. It just makes life miserable for people living through displacement, but it doesn't make them more likely to return. And so I think that we need more evidence on that, but and we have I have an ongoing study with Syrians, a panel study that will look at that more in depth. I'll end there.
Great, thank you, Dan. If I'm remembering correctly, maybe it was a conference version of that paper that I read, but it seemed to be that the home country factors were much more important in people's decision making about whether or not to stay in a host country.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, thank you for drawing out the converse side. Yeah, people look to the situation at home. People want to return home when it's safe. In this study of Syrian refugees in Lebanon, and it's clear from the data that right now for Syrians in the Middle East, they don't consider Syria to be safe. And so we have seen, as Lebanon has descended into extreme unsafety, we have seen about 20%, according to some of the numbers that I've seen, of Syrians go back to Syria. But we're going to have to see what share of those people actually stay in Syria now, and what share find some way to get back to Lebanon. And again, I think it's important, when we think about what apparently pushed people back, this is war, it's destruction of towns, it's bombings. This should not be taken, in my view, as evidence that the push factors that a hosting government can shift, like access to education, access to work, access to healthcare will push people back. So war pushing people to leave the country should not be taken as evidence that a broader set of push factors will make people likely to return. It's factors at home, it's safety at home that people are waiting for to return.
Yeah, so horrific when Syria seems like the safer option. Okay, I'll turn it over to Jocelyn now.
Thank you so much. And I think the other piece of that conversation in terms of protracted nature of work and temporality of refugees planning their lives as well as governments planning for refugee hosting is this government mindset also that refugee populations are temporary and will go home tomorrow. You know, there is very rarely long-term planning of, well, in a decade, this group will still be here. But when we're looking at a lot of the largest countries where refugees are coming from, we are dealing with protracted situations where nothing has meaningfully improved in the instability, conflict, governance situation in decades. And so we have no reason to believe that this is true, that tomorrow something will magically change and people will return home. And that connects to a lot of the climate work that we're doing in terms of national adaptation planning, because when governments are developing these plans for their territories, they're often operating under this assumption that these settlements or camps are temporary and so don't need to be included in these plans, even though realistically the evidence points to the contrary, and that the land that these people are often living on is some of the least desirable, valuable land because it's often exceptionally climate exposed or difficult to grow crops on, etc. And so that's why it's already been sort of used to host refugees, and then additionally isn't being included in adaptation planning that governments are doing. And then similarly, I think for people's mindsets living in these environments, they're often operating on sort of a shorter temporal scale in that they are not necessarily wanting to invest in adaptation measures for their homes or for planting trees that might take a decade to grow and produce fruit and fruit trees, or invest in irrigation techniques or seeds that might take several seasons to then actually provide a return on that investment. And so I think when you combine all of these factors of sort of everyone's consideration of how long they might be living in a place, there's a lot of precarity and temporality, and also that people don't have secure land tenure rights. So even if they don't think that they're going home soon, they might not be confident that they're going to be able to stay in the exact place that they're currently based. So I think addressing some of those planning pieces, and this feeds into the longer term conversations of trying to align displacement and refugee policy planning timelines with development planning timelines, and sort of drawing those planning timelines out and aligning policies such that development planning is inclusive of refugees. And then that kind of follows on to climate planning, which is linked to development planning with livelihoods and things. And then I think the other big piece of this from the research is around what actual documentation and policy changes can be made to support refugees to access certain rights or livelihoods. And so that's a lot of basic things like access to identity documents. Across a lot of Africa, there's the concerns of like know your customer laws, and that you need a certain identity document in order to even get an official cell phone, which you need for bank accounts or, transferring mobile money. And so this lack of formal registration and identity documents, and also the sort of refugee status determination processes that can drag on for years and years. So lack of those formal identity documents really impedes access to other rights, such as access to formal employment or, trade, owning a business, owning property, sort of everything else that one could do to be self-reliant or more reliant on oneself than on humanitarian assistance. And then I think the third piece is this sort of fear of we're moving to a self-reliance model, or that's sort of what every donor country and international agency wants. And, most refugees would prefer as well, I'm sure, given the right environment to actually achieve that. And I think without those conditions in place, and then also, if it's largely agrarian or raising livestock, you need adaptive capacity so that people aren't falling into what's happening to a lot of host community populations or receiving communities, is thus saying that people are losing their livelihoods, are now dependent on assistance because they're starving because of drought and extreme heat or crop failure, or flooding, the inverse. That's completely destroyed their livelihoods, whether they're subsistence farmers or trading based on agriculture. That we can't tell people they must be self-reliant. We're removing all humanitarian assistance and then not give them the tools to actually adapt to the hazards of climate change that we know are coming in a lot of these communities.
Great. Thank you so much, Jocelyn. So we have 12 minutes or so for questions now. I saw one in the chat from Ellen. I don't know if others are planning to raise their hand. I can't actually see anyone but the participants, really. But I can ask Ellen's question. So I think that was mostly directed to Dan. How much Lebanese migration, I guess Syrians or Lebanese or others, are we seeing going into Syria?
The most recent numbers that I've seen from UNHCR on this, and they're updating a dashboard on displacement in Lebanon every couple of days. And so the most recent update I saw was October 28th, was that about 200,000 Syrians had fled Lebanon to Syria, and about 30,000 Lebanese have now fled Lebanon to Syria. So about 30,000 Lebanese refugees in Syria now. And I think on this point, it's important to also mention that these 30,000 Lebanese refugees who have gone to Syria are just a small share of the overall displacement we're seeing in Lebanon, since there's a tremendous number, likely more than 1 million Lebanese IDPs within Lebanon.
Thank you, Dan. Oh, I'm sorry. We have 90 minutes. I think I didn't realize that. I thought we were finished at 10. All right. Well, we have lots of time for questions then. I will ask another one in that case. So some of you have talked. Oh, actually, sorry, Ellen, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to go first?
I just want to follow a follow-up question on this and another one, if it's okay to ask. So, Dan, one of the things that's interesting about the Syrian case, right, is that we have various governance regimes across the space of Syria now, right? So I'm just wondering if you can say anything about, in those terms, where do Syrians tend to be going back to, right? Is there any relationship between who is essentially sort of really governing the space and where do people go back to? And then just a second question, sort of for everybody, but that is when we think about, and I liked your point, Beth, about receiving communities rather than host communities, right? But when we think about that, at least in Sweden and in the Nordic cases, there was a sense that you brought in people, there was a certain sort of period of kind of training and integration, but then a lot of the notion for a while was to send people into, Syrians specifically, into areas that had lower populations or we were depopulating. And part of that argument was, well, because then they'll be around a lot of Swedes and they'll sort of, understand Swedish perspectives and Swedish culture and they'll become integrated more. So my question is, do we know if that's right? Like, what do we know about the extent to which, either IDPs or internally displaced are in, kind of homogenous communities, right, with others who are refugees versus who are sort of sent out to be, a minority in an otherwise, kind of host or recipient sort of community. Does that make a difference for how much they are really integrated into the new space?
Maybe I could offer some response on the first question and then turn it over for the second question. So thankfully, on the UNHCR data that I referenced does have a breakdown of the provinces in Syria that people are going to. And so we don't know if the people are from these areas. There's not a breakdown of whether people are going home, but like the broad pattern that you can see. So, and anybody can go to this website. It's UNHCR Core, the comprehensive overview of response to emergencies. So UNHCR Core for Syria. And we can see that for Lebanese refugees to Syria, there's a real concentration of that population around the right outside the Lebanese border. So it seems, Lebanese are largely, but not exclusively, going to areas just bordering Lebanon. Syrians are going to places much more spread across the country, Aleppo, Raqqa, everywhere across the country. And from a quick look at the map, it looks like there's a higher concentration of people going to the capitals of the governorates. And we can't separate if this is, whether this is people who are from the capitals going home, or if people are disproportionately returning to urban areas, even if they were from rural areas before. I think those are some interesting and important questions to explore. But yeah, we can see that there's a spread across Syria for the Syrians who are going back.
Beth or Jocelyn, do you want to stab at Ellen's other question?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I haven't seen any figures for Sweden, although I'm sure the research exists because there's been so much research on Middle Eastern refugees in Sweden. I'm sure there's data available. But from other contexts, you see that refugees often feel more comfortable in cities. Cities tend to be more diverse, more tolerant. You have a lot of secondary migration. And, that's something I think we overlook. We tend to think, well, you're a refugee and that's it. But there's a lot of dynamic movements of people going back and forth, or people moving on to other places. Some of the research from Germany shows that people settled in these small villages, particularly in what was formerly Eastern Germany, have moved. When they get the chance and they, completed their integration courses and so forth, they see more opportunities for jobs and for social life and culture, and to hook up with other members of the diaspora in cities. And that's been an experience in Canada as well. And on the other hand, in the United States, you've got some very conservative communities in the middle part of the country, and a lot of evangelical Christians that have welcomed refugees from the Middle East who do amazingly well. The hospitality and the care and the concern, I think, has surprised a lot of people in the refugee community in the U.S. that, hey, Syrians are doing really well in Nebraska and Iowa, and that some of these groups that we label as very, very conservative Trump followers are actually act very differently when it's somebody in their community, when they see it as their responsibility to welcome them. So I think the evidence in the U.S. is a little bit mixed, but in general, I think people feel more comfortable in cities than they do in small towns.
There's a question in the chat, I think probably best directed towards Jocelyn from Samuel. So are most sub-Saharan refugees fleeing from conflict or economic reasons, or does it depend on the country?
Yeah, so I think, the specific answer to this is when you're looking at refugees who are meeting the conventional definition under the UN Convention on the Status of Refugees, or the African Union's definition that people are fleeing persecution on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, political beliefs, social groups, or are fleeing conflict, generalized instability. And so to meet those criteria to be a refugee, then you would be fleeing more than just sort of economic concerns. But I think when we look at migration writ large, these issues overlap, intersect, and people move for probably a dozen different reasons that has to do with economic factors, government factors, possibly specific factors to them that they're not getting government benefits or they're being persecuted by the government, which might make them eligible for refugee status. And then those can also overlap with how they're experiencing natural disasters, climate change. Maybe they're not getting the same amount of government assistance that other groups are. And then a lot of demographic factors and familial factors. Do they have enough money to move? Do they have people who are dependent on them that they're sending money home to that's encouraging them to move? Are they healthy enough to move? Are they healthy enough to engage in work in the place that they're moving to? And so I think you see a lot more migration of people who are not considered refugees and wouldn't be applying for asylum necessarily around sub-Saharan Africa. But not all of those people would be considered refugees. And I think most people that are moving now who are refugees are often leaving often better or previously better economic situations to be living in places where they have fewer economic opportunities, but it's safer. So with Sudan, for example, a lot of people leaving Khartoum, I think a quarter of those leaving Sudan right now and going to Uganda at least have university degrees, but are ending up in settlements where they're being, told the main opportunity there is agriculture or sort of small scale businesses. And so they're certainly leaving much better economic environments prior to the renewal of conflict there for fewer economic opportunities in Uganda, but because of the violence have chosen to leave. And I think that's the case in a lot of places.
Great. Thank you, Jocelyn. Sandra has a really excellent question in the chat. I'm just going to read it. And even though it's directed towards Jocelyn, I'm going to open it up to everyone. So she says, Jocelyn made a very good point about the challenge faced by cities hosting displaced people that have little control over national policies regarding refugees or a budget sufficient to address their needs and the needs of other urban poor. I think there can also be political challenges, for example, if the political party governing the municipality is different from that which is governing the country. Does she, or Beth or Dan, know of any examples of cities that are handling this well in terms of budget sharing, policy integration, and or long-term planning? So a question very focused on local spaces. Jocelyn, since it's addressed to you, if you want to address it first, but then I think Beth or Dan could also jump in.
Sure. Yeah. I'll drop a resource in the chat. There is some research from the Equal Partnerships Project on intermediary cities in Africa, and sort of because a lot of the movement is maybe from a rural area to a smaller city, and those smaller cities have even fewer resources. So I think that I know more about places experiencing challenges and very little best practices in terms of budget sharing, policy integration, and long-term planning. I think very few cities have gotten that far along. The cities I would say that are handling this well or are thinking about this most proactively, I guess, are cities that are taking a really active role in global policy environments. So Yvonne Aki-Sawyer, who's the mayor of Freetown, Sierra Leone, is really involved in climate advocacy as well as migration advocacy globally. Speaking at the UN General Assembly in September, has done a lot of work on infrastructure projects to support people living in informal settlements, which is supporting kind of migrants as well as lower income people that are living in Freetown. Some other work that's come out is on cities gaining access to multilateral development bank funding. And so Quito, Ecuador was sort of an early adopter of this. And this goes to the political question that you raised, that the mayor of Quito at the time was from a different political party than the national government. So the national government would not sign on to a loan from the World Bank for Quito to build a metro, which would be a more green environmental option because it would be run on electricity rather than gas. And so Quito managed to receive funding from 4 different MDBs in order to fund the metro. And that was a real shift in sort of multilateral development bank funding to go directly to cities for this kind of work. And I think we'll see more of that both in the climate infrastructure financing world as well as maybe within the migration world. And the link there is a lot of advocacy for national adaptation plans and other climate financing to include mobility provisions. So to include support for migrants, to include support for displaced populations, natural disaster preparedness, et cetera, in those adaptation plans, which opens up sort of a world of funding from the Green Climate Fund, from the World Bank, from the Adaptation Fund, now the Loss and Damage Fund, that could then be used to support migration policy, welcoming policies, natural disaster preparedness and response policies for people displaced, which I think could be really beneficial for cities. But I do think it's sort of in its early stages that we don't have a ton of resources available. But I will drop that one link in the chat after I'm done speaking. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Dan or Beth, do you want to answer from your perspectives?
I can jump in on internal displacement where, to follow up what Jocelyn said, it's often all about money. You know, in Colombia, for example, which has probably the strongest legislation, whole raft of laws and policies on IDPs, you know, there are basic assertions in national legislation that say, for example, every displaced child has the right to education. But when you talk to mayors of receiving communities, they say, well, that's the obligation, but we have no more resources. And how do we handle another 20% of students in our schools? We don't have money for schools or more teachers. So, you know, the government expects us to do this, but they don't give us the resources, which really comes down to governance questions, you know, in terms of structures of government, the extent to which you have a unitary state or federal state, and, you know, where the resources are and how they match these obligations at the national level. So, you know, I think cities face tremendous challenges, and there are some good examples. Medellin in Colombia, I think, has done a terrific job of facilitating the integration of IDPs into their city. They've got, you know, they changed their whole public transport system to make sure that people living in informal settlements could access jobs and in the big city of Medellin. And so there are some good examples, but, you know, my impression is that most local governments are really struggling, maybe want to do the right thing, but, you know, local governments have a host of priorities. You know, urban issues everywhere are complicated, infrastructure and provision of services and underserved communities and poor people and people living in informal settlements, which is our euphemistic word for slums these days. But, you know, they've got other pressures. And, you know, is supporting refugees or IDPs more or less important than, you know, poor moms who need additional health care. So, I mean, I think it's really tough on local governments to draw some of these, make some of these tough decisions, particularly when there's never enough money.
I see. Well, maybe I'll give Dan a chance to respond, and then we'll come back to you, Jocelyn.
Yeah, sure. I'll be brief, but I think that you know, my experience from my research is often local authorities are much more pragmatic about managing the challenges than national level politicians who might feel more constrained by politics and, you know, the pressures from xenophobic public attitudes. But, you know, say like in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, where I did field work, you know, there was a really clear picture of the way in which you know, we could think about what sort of strategies and relationships and policies really mattered most for refugee survival. So thinking about refugees' relationships with and impacts from municipal authorities, from employers, from refugee-led community organizations. And so although I don't have a specific community in the Bekaa to point to as a grand success, I think that, you know, every day in the relationships between refugees and municipal authorities, there was effective problem solving going on through this like pragmatic solution centered approach when they were, I would say, you know, not to put it too strongly, but not constrained by the pressures that national level politicians feel to grandstand with anti-refugee rhetoric and appeal to national voters.
That makes sense. Jocelyn, did you want to add something else to that comment?
Yeah, it was just to sort of U.S. policy as well on this, that, you know, we're thinking of this as receiving communities who are often in the global South, but that we have a lot of the same challenges in a lot of global North countries. That earlier this year, when we saw a lot of outcry, I guess, over New York City's migrant welcoming policies and sort of the busing of migrants from the southern border to New York and other cities. The challenge there is that asylum seekers are not allowed to work for at least the first 6 months that they are in the United States after applying for asylum. And New York has a housing policy where it will provide housing to anyone in need of it. And so the national level policy prohibiting people from working is now bumping up against these city policies where people are being provided with housing and other services. But that's being stressed by the fact that national restrictions are preventing people from working. And so a lot of business leaders, faith leaders, government leaders have signed on to a Let Asylum Seekers Work campaign, but we're bumping into those political pressures at the national level that Daniel's mentioning of prohibiting asylum seekers from working because I think people portray it as a pull factor, even if it may not be.
Great. Thanks for reminding us that a lot of these same challenges are faced even in wealthy countries in the global north too, right? There's 2 questions in the chat. So the first one is from Anna. Thanks so much for this great discussion. One of the issues with protracted displacement is that when a displacement crisis, quote unquote, starts, there is normally an immediate surge of humanitarian aid. However, when global attention shifts, support is greatly reduced, even though populations remain displaced. How can we bridge that gap and better facilitate the transition from short-term humanitarian aid to long-term development in protracted displacement situations? And some of you had already alluded to this gap in some of your comments earlier, but maybe if you could just elaborate. Why don't we start in the order we were doing before with Beth and then Dan and then Joss?
Yeah, this brings up this question of the famous humanitarian development or humanitarian development peace nexus, which gets a lot of attention at the international level. Everybody recognizes that you really need all 3 kinds of actions to deal with displacement. But, I don't think it's working very well, and sometimes it's just, humanitarian actors think development folks should come in with their funding to support these long-term solutions. But for many development actors, the situation isn't yet stable enough. One thing we've learned is to really support solutions, you have to start from the beginning. You don't wait for 4 or 5 years and then start to think about it. But, in those early years, development actors say, well, we can't establish a bank account in this country. The conflict's ongoing. We'll wait till things settle down and then we can get involved. And then there are, I think of organizational cultural differences on the humanitarian side. You're lucky if you can plan for a year. I mean, most programs are 3 months or 6 months, and development actors often work with a 5-year time plan. And let's spend the year figuring out what we want to do to make sure it's sustainable and has government buy-in. So, it's kind of start from this different perceptions of how do we plan, how do we budget. Development actors almost always depend on close relationships with the governments. The governments, you want it to be locally owned, and so when the intervention from outsiders ends, the government will carry it on. So, local ownership and working closely with governments is key. And humanitarian actors, frankly, often see governments as the problem. Don't see them as supportive, particularly in internal displacement and in places like Syria, for example, where, to work with the government, really limits your possibilities. Well, you have to work with the government if you want to aid IDPs in Syria, but, the government isn't seen as a particularly sympathetic actor. And so there's kind of a reluctance to engage them too much in planning for assistance to people that they're not very supportive of. So I think there are a lot of problems in actually implementing it. And then when you add peace actors, particularly peace support operations, whether it's the UN or other multinational forces, it's a very different set of actors that come with different missions, if you will. Oftentimes they come with a lot more money. In places like Mali, for example, the stabilization forces had, I think the figure was something like 100 times more funds than the humanitarians did. And yet when they're working on similar issues, such as return of IDPs, it's hard to see how they coordinate or even if they speak the same language. So, I think there's a lot of work to be done. And maybe local authorities can break this logjam, who have good relations with both development, humanitarian, and sometimes with peace actors as well. But I don't know. I think we need to do a lot of work to translate this rhetoric into meaningful change for displaced people.
Thanks, Beth. Daniel, do you want to comment on this question?
Yeah. So I think I want to circle back to the point I made at the absolute beginning that aid is an important source of refugee survival and well-being, but it isn't, if we were to try to think about it in sort of a comparative way, the number one source of refugee survival. It's like the number one driver of refugee well-being. And so this is a push to think about refugee agency in their own survival strategies. I'm not saying we need to think about how to restore refugee agency. I'm saying that refugee sort of independent survival is actually just the reality of the situation right now. And So, there's limited data on this, but I've seen estimates say in Betts and Collier's books, Refuge, they say that 1 in 10 Syrian refugees in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan receive any material support from the United Nations. And, and I'd love to see data on this for other regions to get a sense of the share of refugees receiving assistance. And then I would also bet that if we could get reliable data on this, among refugees who are getting assistance, the amount that they get is not nearly enough for them to just live on that. And so the reality is that even with aid coming into different levels, even with restrictions on work and mobility that refugees face in most hosting countries, refugees are still working. Refugees are still starting businesses, even if they're informal, finding ways to get money for themselves and their families, working together to get public infrastructure delivered to their communities. And so I just view this as an under-recognized reality of how refugees survive. And it calls for us to shift our thinking about refugee response from a framework that centers us as humanitarian practitioners, technocrats, scholars, or sort of the program policy community, to one that centers refugees in our theoretical framework of what drives refugee well-being, one that acknowledges that the number one factor that determines refugee well-being is refugee action. And that needs to be the foundation from which we're designing policy. And so directly to Anna's question, even as aid decreases from what are, even at their highest levels, a small share of the drivers of refugee survival, if we're thinking as aid drops off even below that point, we need to be thinking, how are refugees going to continue to survive? And so our starting point shouldn't be what aid programs work to support refugee survival. We need frameworks, we need research to think, what are the ways in which refugees are currently surviving, and how can interventions and policy intervene on those margins to support the strategies that refugees are actually using and building in their own communities to survive. And so this touches on a piece that I published last year in the American Political Science Review on how refugees use their social networks to survive, how they seek out resources and work together to solve problems, to try and get some evidence of what are the strategies and features of communities, of some refugee communities on their own to use aid, but use all of the other resources that they have to try to mitigate the profound problems that they face.
Thank you so much, Dan. Jocelyn.
Yeah, I think to Daniel's final point there's the other large piece around remittances, and that most people displaced, the overall share of remittances that are going from communities to their families is larger than the official amount of aid that's going to those countries and communities. And so people that are already displaced are the ones responding in largest form. And I think if we take a step back from the on the ground humanitarian development nexus and some of the issues that Beth was raising, you have the larger question of responsibility for these funding and development issues and legacies of colonialism, and now legacies of climate change and the impacts of climate change. And, using Michael Doyle's frameworks of sort of proximity versus culpability versus capacity, like who is really responsible for supporting the cost of providing support to displaced communities and providing a welcoming environment for those communities. And very rarely the responsible party is not the one that's hosting them. Countries that are hosting displaced populations are very rarely the ones who have initiated the conflict or the natural disaster, et cetera, that has displaced them, or development projects when you get into those questions as well. And so financing that development with high interest loans is not necessarily a fair solution, and it's not going to get countries that are hosting refugees out of the sort of loan debt repayment trap. And then that scales down to the local level as well, where people are facing individual economic crises, whether that's loss of crops or their store was destroyed by flooding, et cetera. and they're taking out high interest loans in order to just get their heads above water again and reopen their business or plant crops next season. And they're in the cycle of debt repayment because they don't have access to formal banking institutions or low interest loans. And so I think as we move forward to funding for various forms of loss and damage in the climate world, but also adaptation measures or future development displacement response measures, it needs to be done from a point of view of, who has made money historically from these economic systems and crises that have resulted in this displacement, and that's not a way for businesses or banks to make money on interest, that these need to be highly concessional loans or grants that are being distributed. And I mean, when we see the funding appeals for humanitarian assistance coming in at 10% or 30% of the needed amount, we know that there is something that needs to change in terms of the system of funding of self-reliance or humanitarian assistance that's being provided to communities who are displaced.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jocelyn. Samahir has a question in the Q&A that I think gets at some of these points that you all have been raising in terms of global inequity, Dan's points about agency of displaced peoples and refugees, and whether systems enable that or don't enable that. So Samahir asks, is the global refugee system broken? Does it need reform or redesign? If so, how can the responsibilities be clearly defined without the evasion from responsibility schemes that we see now? So it's a big question. I'll leave it to all of you to answer it as you see applicable from your regions of expertise. So we'll do the same order.
Okay, thanks. I think the system is really under threat. I think basic protections are eroding for lots of reasons. The big fear, though, is that reopening the convention or trying to design a new system in this present world of anti-immigrant attitudes, that we'd wind up with something much more restrictive. So what you see are a lot of kind of patchwork solutions, with stretching the refugee definition to include people affected by criminal violence in Central America, for example, or domestic violence, or because of their sexual orientation or identity. So you see efforts to really work within the system we have, and then to put together these other kind of mini multilateral initiatives that are, states that are willing to work together on particular issues outside of the UN, such as the Platform on Disaster Displacement that Jocelyn knows well, that are really doing a lot of creative work to deal with people who may have to cross an international border because of disasters or eventually climate change. So there's some good things happening on the margins, but I don't think we're going to see a major new positive international agreement on dealing with people who are displaced. Nor, working with IDPs has always been tricky because governments really feel like it's their sovereign right to do in their countries what they want, rather than be subservient to international standards. So we've got some soft international law on internal displacement, but a real resistance to codifying that or coming up with anything that would imply a binding international obligation. So I think everybody is struggling with it. The system isn't working well. It was designed to meet the needs of post-war Europe, not to meet the needs that we see today. Everybody recognizes this, but the real disagreement on what the fixes are to come up with a new convention or new understanding just seems very risky right now. Sorry not to be more positive. I mean, you probably want to end this on an upbeat note, so.
Maybe we'll have one more chance for that in a minute, but I think you painted the reality. Dan, on to you.
Yeah, so I mean, I unfortunately have more to say on the problems with the system than useful proposals for reforming it, but I agree that there are reasons to think that the system is broken. And so if we think about the three so-called durable solutions to displacement of return, local integration, or third country resettlement, we see that, those are an inadequate toolkit for responding to displacement based on the numbers. And so from the numbers I've seen each year, less than 1% of refugees worldwide receive citizenship in a hosting country, which we can think of as one obvious way to implement local integration. And each year on average, only about 1, maybe 2% of refugees worldwide are resettled to a third country. And so we're talking tiny numbers of people who are getting local integration or third country resettlement, two of those solutions. And although the numbers on return are harder to put a specific estimate out for, there's a vast number of people, and Beth laid out the numbers on protracted displacement. Well, there's a huge number of people who are not able to return home, either at any point in the near future. I mean, we look to Syria. What are the prospects in the next couple years for Syria to be safe, for people to go home? Even the reports that you can find from Amnesty International, from Human Rights Watch, about the systematic abuses and arrests, torture, murder of people who are refugees who are returning to Syria. And also, there are going to be some people who, due to the political situation in their home country, may never be able to go home in their life. Generations may not ever be able to go home. And so what we're left with is a situation where there is a substantial portion of refugees worldwide for whom there is no durable solution. So, the formal framework of return, local integration, or resettlement, none of those work for a substantial share of refugees worldwide. And so for me, the numbers tell a clear story that there is something fundamentally broken about the system, and we need new response approach. The UNHCR has ideas around, it's like one approach is complementary pathways. This idea of designing approaches, say, to give people long-term work visas in third countries. And so it isn't any of those three approaches, but there is generation of ideas like this, but we need different approaches because the three main approaches, the durable solutions right now, clearly aren't meeting the needs for a large number of displaced people around the world now.
Absolutely. Jocelyn?
Yeah, I won't belabor the point too much. I completely agree with what Beth and Dan have said, but I think in terms of the way to move forward, there is a need for a lot more flexible migration regimes, because I think the other challenge with climate is that as people might not be able to engage in traditional livelihoods that they may have in their home communities, they aren't interested in necessarily leaving permanently either. And so the way that our travel and visa and asylum regimes are set up right now makes it really difficult for people, whether they're coming formally or informally to another location, to do that in a flexible way, in a way that might enable circular seasonal migration or temporary migration for a few years and then, moving home for a few years. Or, just a lot of the flexibility that many of us with passports from the global north are able to take advantage of in the sort of modern working environment that those from other countries are not. So I think one promising avenue that I see are regional free mobility regimes. And I know there's a project out tracking that Diego Acosta has been putting together in terms of free mobility regimes in different regions. And then when we talk about climate specifically, I like Dan's use of the word toolkit. That's something that Walter Kalin and others from the Platform on Disaster Displacement have really highlighted, that we need a toolkit approach. It's not one climate migration visa or one climate refugee status, but it's that people are going to need temporary solutions in some cases, permanent solutions in other cases, labor visas in some cases. You'll have wholesale movement of communities, and in other places you will just have individuals moving. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but having a much more flexible migration regime will address these different factors of people moving for economic reasons, layered on top of instability, layered on top of climate-driven and disaster migration. So the need to determine exactly which factor was the main cause, or that someone has to prove the way they do in an asylum case that they're moving for a reason that they could get status due to their, say, climate-driven status, is going to be really difficult and exclusionary. And I think we need to be thinking about it in a much more encompassing and inclusive way as we go forward to fix what's broken right now.
Okay. If we have time, can I... Oh, sorry, Dan, what did you want to add?
Could I offer one just small addition to echoing Jocelyn's point about the potential rewards from flexible policies here and allowing for the possibility of circular movement? So from the work on refugee return, I mentioned the finding that harsh policies from host governments don't seem to push people to return. But the interviews also suggest that there could be unintended consequences of these strict border regimes, such that if people go back to their home country, it would be extremely difficult for them to get back to the hosting country. And I think there's an unintended effect there that might depress return, in the sense that it prevents people from going home to take scoping trips safely, begin to reestablish economic networks, go back home and see what the safety situation is, check in with family there. People might not want to take those preliminary scoping trips if the border regime is really firm and they won't be able to re-enter the home country. And so there might be this unintended downstream effect of harsh border policies that actually long-term reduce refugee return.
Yeah, and that's certainly the case with migration. You look at the U.S. border policies, a lot of the traditional circular migration where people would come and work in the harvest and go back home and come back the next year. I mean, a lot of that stopped because people are afraid they won't be able to get back, and so they're staying longer in the U.S.
Exactly, that makes sense. Jocelyn, I see you had a one finger too.
When you look at in the climate world, we have what are called the SSPs, the shared socioeconomic pathways, and that's sort of comparing those against trajectories of emissions. One of the factors that they use there is border policies, and you see a lot more positive outcomes in the modeling when you have more flexible rather than stringent border policies, because it does improve sort of the outcomes for everyone that can move to where it's safe for them, not overcrowding cities maybe in Central America, but allowing people to move onward to other locations, but also to return home when they can, rather than feeling like they're stuck in another location because they might not be able to come back later on.
That makes a lot of sense. I was going to ask all of you to go around and have a chance to offer like one positive development at the local level you see, maybe in terms of, bettering situations for refugees. But I think you already did that in your set of comments for the most part. There's a paper we just published recently from Beth called Refugee Relocation Can Be a Positive Experience. So I was going to offer to have her talk about that, but I'll just drop it in the chat. And I'll just thank all of you for your incredible contributions today. It's a huge topic, and thank you for breaking it down for us at different regions and on different topics and themes. So I'll turn it back over to Ellen now to close us out.
Thank you. I don't have much to add except for to thank all of you. Thank you, Kelsey, and to Beth and Dan and Jocelyn. I think it's been a really interesting discussion and has raised a lot of both, questions and research that we could take forward, as well as food for thought in terms of policy. So to thank you for that, to invite you to a couple of upcoming events to let you know about them. There will be a sort of workshop on ethnic enclaves and refugee employment for those who are interested, and there should be a lot of those watching this. Aisha Kayoglu will be speaking on November 20th. It's a work in progress, so we'll be workshopping a paper that she's presenting. And then on December 5th, we have another one on implications of affirmative action on political attitudes. So you're welcome to both of those, and anything else, you can see the events in the GLD gu.se calendar. And also feel free to reach out if you're interested in engaging otherwise. So again, thank you for the work, the roundtable today, and also look forward to seeing many of you in future occasions. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, and see you soon.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.